Most people believe manifestation requires affirmations, visualizations, and patient waiting. But what if the very act of trying is the reason you fail? In 1936, Neville Goddard stood in a New York apartment with no money, no ticket, and a desperate desire to sail home to Barbados for Christmas. He had been studying with Abdullah, an Ethiopian rabbi who taught the mystical interpretation of Scripture. When Neville explained his predicament, Abdullah gave him a simple instruction. Then days later, when Neville tried to discuss the impossibility of his situation, Abdullah did something shocking. He slammed the door in Neville's face. That door slam became the most powerful lesson Neville ever received about the law of assumption. It revealed why most people never manifest what they desire. They discuss, they analyze. They remain in the state of wanting instead of having. Today, you will learn why the greatest spiritual teachers refuse to entertain doubt, why your financial struggles persist because you keep acknowledging them, and how to use the door slam principle to transform debt into abundance. Neville Goddard's story begins with raw human desire. He had not seen his family in years. The longing for home consumed him. December approached, and the dream of spending Christmas in Barbados became an obsession. But reality painted a different picture. He possessed no savings. His bank account held nothing. The steamship ticket cost more than he could earn in months. Depression set in. This is the state most people occupy when they discover the law. They want something desperately. The contrast between desire and current circumstance creates pain. The mind fixates on lack. Every morning brings fresh evidence that the goal remains impossible. The rent is due. The debt collectors call. The relationship stays broken. The body stays sick. And in that state of awareness, people search for solutions. Neville found Abdullah. The teacher had already transformed Neville's understanding of Scripture. Abdullah taught that the Bible was not history, but psychology. Every character represented a state of consciousness. Every story described the journey from limitation to realization. When Neville confessed his desire to sail home, Abdullah did not offer sympathy. He did not suggest patience or hard work or creative problem-solving. Instead, he made a declaration that seemed insane. Abdullah told Neville, "You are in Barbados. Not you will be, or you can be, or you should visualize being." Present tense, absolute statement. You are already there. This instruction contains the entire law of assumption. It demands that consciousness shift from the state of wanting to the state of having. But Neville, like most students, failed to grasp the depth of this truth. He made the first critical mistake. He tried. Trying reveals doubt. When you try to manifest, you admit you have not yet assumed the state of the wish fulfilled. Neville returned to Abdullah days later and began explaining the obstacles. He outlined the financial impossibility. He described his lack of resources. He asked how he could possibly get to Barbados. This conversation represented everything wrong with conventional manifestation teaching. Abdullah's response was immediate and fierce. He became angry, not at Neville's circumstances, but at his consciousness. "You are in Barbados," Abdullah repeated. Neville persisted. He wanted to discuss the method. He wanted to understand the mechanics. He wanted to know the bridge of incidents that would materialize the ticket. Abdullah refused to engage. The conversation ended with the famous door slam. Neville stood in the hallway, shocked and confused. But that rejection became the catalyst for his breakthrough. The slammed door was not cruelty. It was instruction. Abdullah demonstrated the only proper response to doubt, refused to acknowledge it, refused to entertain the old state, refused to give attention to lack. The door slam symbolized the Sabbath. In Scripture, the Sabbath represents rest, not physical rest but mental rest. Cessation of labor. When God created the world, he rested on the seventh day. This rest was not exhaustion but completion. The work was finished. Nothing remained to be done. Neville realized that Abdullah was teaching him to rest in the assumption, to close the door on the senses, to refuse to discuss impossibility, to live as though the desire had already materialized. William Blake, the mystical poet Neville often quoted, called this state double vision. Blake wrote that man perceives with two organs. The mortal eye sees the world of effects. The immortal eye sees the world of causes. Most people live exclusively through mortal sight. They see debt and call it reality. They see sickness and accept it as truth. But the awakened consciousness learns to see with the immortal eye, to perceive not what is, but what is assumed. The law of assumption states that consciousness is the only reality. What you assume to be true becomes true in your experience, not because you wish it or hope it or work toward it, because assumption hardens into fact. Neville taught that imagination creates reality. When he said imagination, he did not mean fantasy or daydreaming. He meant the act of assuming a state so completely that the outer world must conform. This principle appears throughout Scripture when properly decoded. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus instructs his disciples, "Let the dead bury their dead." On the surface, this statement seems cold, but the metaphysical interpretation reveals profound truth. The dead represent those who live in the consciousness of limitation, the walking dead. People whose attention remains fixed on past failures, current obstacles, and statistical probabilities. Jesus commanded his followers to abandon that state entirely. Do not give it attention. Do not argue with it. Let it bury itself. Abdullah's door slam was his version of this teaching. Let the dead bury the dead. Let the old state of lack die without your participation. Do not attend its funeral. Do not mourn its passing. Close the door and walk into the new assumption. Neville applied this instruction. He stopped discussing the impossibility. He stopped calculating the odds. He entered the feeling of being in Barbados. He felt the warm Caribbean air. He heard his family's voices. He smelled his mother's cooking. He assumed the state so completely that within days, external events shifted. His brother, living in Barbados, felt compelled to send him a ticket. The money appeared as a gift. The circumstances rearranged themselves without Neville's manipulation. The bridge of incidents unfolded naturally because consciousness had changed. This is the secret that modern manifestation teaching misses. You do not create the how. You do not strategize the path. You assume the end. The middle takes care of itself. Joseph Murphy, another student of Abdullah who taught similar principles, explained it this way. Your subconscious mind is infinitely intelligent. It knows how to bring about any result once the end is firmly impressed upon it. But it cannot work when the conscious mind interferes with doubt, analysis, and contrary assumptions. The door must be slammed on those thoughts. They are not just unhelpful, they are creative in the opposite direction. How does this ancient wisdom apply to your debt today? The same principle operates. Most people with financial struggle make Neville's first mistake. They try. They create vision boards while simultaneously discussing their lack with friends. They affirm abundance while checking their bank account with anxiety. They pray for provision while planning for scarcity. This double-mindedness guarantees failure. The door slam technique requires brutal mental discipline. When the thought of debt arises, you must slam the door. When someone asks about your financial situation, you respond from the state of abundance, not as a lie, but as an assumption. You are not pretending wealth exists. You are assuming the consciousness of wealth. This distinction is everything. Pretending admits falsehood. Assuming claims truth. Neville taught that feeling is the secret, not emotion, but the feeling of the wish fulfilled. What would it feel like if the debt disappeared today? Not relief. Relief implies previous burden. What would it feel like if you had always lived in abundance, that feeling, that naturalness, that calm certainty? You must inhabit that state regardless of external evidence. This practice contradicts every conventional financial advisor. They will tell you to face reality, to make budgets, to acknowledge your situation. Those actions have their place in the world of effects, but they cannot change the cause. Consciousness is cause. The outer world is effect. You cannot solve a problem from the level of the problem. You must rise to the level of the solution. And the solution is always a shift in assumption. Consider the Kabbalistic interpretation of scripture that Abdullah taught Neville. In Hebrew mysticism, the letter Shin represents fire, divine fire, the fire that consumes the old and births the new. When you slam the door on the old assumption, you activate this fire. You burn away the consciousness of limitation. What remains is the pure state of your desire fulfilled. The mystics called this transformation death and rebirth. Paul wrote, "I die daily." He referred not to physical death, but to the daily death of the old state. William Blake understood this process deeply. He wrote that imagination is not a state, but the human existence itself. Every man lives in the world of his imagination. Change the imagination, and you change the world. Blake called the mortal body the vegetable glass of nature, a mirror that reflects consciousness. Most people believe the mirror determines what they see, but the awakened know that consciousness determines what the mirror shows. Your debt is a mirror, your relationships are mirrors, your health is a mirror. They reflect your dominant assumptions. When you argue with the mirror, you waste energy. When you try to change the reflection without changing the face, you fail. Abdullah slammed the door on Neville's arguments because arguments belong to the old state. The new state has nothing to argue about. It simply is. The metaphysical resolution is simple but demanding. You must choose your state and refuse to be moved from it. This is what Neville meant when he taught living in the end versus thinking of the end. Thinking of the end keeps you in the journey. Living in the end collapses the journey. Time bends, circumstances shift, the how appears. But this practice requires what mystics call the dark night, the period between assumption and manifestation, where the senses scream contradiction, where bills arrive and friends question and doubt whispers. This is where most people fail. They slam the door for a day, then reopen it to check if anything changed. This checking is the poison. Abdullah would have slammed the door again. Neville's final teaching on this principle came years later. He said, "Do not ask me when, do not ask me how. Simply assume you are the man or woman you want to be and remain faithful to that assumption." This faithfulness is the Sabbath, the rest, the completed work. It requires treating your assumption as more real than your senses, as more authoritative than your bank account, as more true than your circumstances. The conclusion is this: manifestation is not a process of making something happen. It is the art of accepting that it is already done. The moment you desire anything, it exists in consciousness. Your only task is to assume the state of having received it, to close the door on every thought, conversation, and action that contradicts that assumption, to let the dead bury the dead, to rest in the Sabbath of completion. This channel exists to transmit these truths with clarity and power. If this teaching resonates with your spirit, if you recognize the authority of consciousness, then subscribe now. Join the community of those who have chosen to live from imagination rather than circumstance, who have learned to slam the door on limitation, who understand that the kingdom of heaven is not a place but a state, and that state is available now. Neville Goddard left us with these words: "Assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled and observe the route that your attention follows. The route will surprise you, the bridge will appear, but only after you have dared to live as though the end is already accomplished. Only after you have refused to discuss the impossibility with anyone, including yourself. Only after you have done what Abdullah did, slammed the door on the old world and walked fully into the new. The door is before you. On one side stands lack, limitation, and the walking dead. On the other side stands your desire fulfilled. You cannot stand in both rooms. You must choose. And when you choose, slam the door behind you. Never look back. Because as Neville taught us, the moment you consent in your imagination to any state, you have called that state into being.